Good evening. Welcome to the Public Library. My name is Keith Greenawalt. I'm the Public Services Manager here. I like to say that's a fancy word for reference librarian. A little bit of background on this program. This was originally scheduled for Monday, October 29th. Unfortunately, we had a hurricane that day, so I had to reschedule. And with the way we do things here at the library, we plan many months in ahead. It's not something that I could just move a month later just with newsletters and publicity and things like that. So here we are telling ghost stories in April. So it is what it is, but so I did most of my research back in the fall, kind of pulled it out a week and a half ago, so I'm a little bit rusty on some of these, so you'll excuse me if I stutter a little bit through some of these. Like I said, I did the vast majority of my reading back in September, October. But my interest in ghost stories is more of a local history tangent. A lot of ghost stories have sort of an interesting story behind them. Whether you believe them or whether you don't, I like the stories that go with them. I always like to say, I don't read fiction, I read nonfiction because truth is stranger than fiction. That's my own personal opinion. My own opinion on ghosts has always been, haven't seen one, I don't believe in them, but I don't not believe in them. I always consider that to be, I have an open mind. Somebody the other day referred to me as a skeptic. So, you know, call me what you will, but that's sort of my own opinion. I think a lot of things can be explained away, but I think there's a lot of things that can't be explained away. Yes, it's sitting on the fence, but it is what it is. So, but like I said, I'm going to tell some of my favorite ghost stories, some of the more prominent ones from Lancaster County. I'm going to leave Lancaster County a little bit. I'm going to go across the river into York for one, and I'm going to go up into Lebanon County for one or two. I go all of 50 feet from the county line for one. So if you have any, I am in no way, shape, or form an expert on ghosts in general. I've never hunted for ghosts. I've never done anything like that. I just like the stories. So I'm pulling most of my tales tonight from a couple of different books. If you're familiar with Mark Nesbitt, he writes the Ghost of Gettysburg series. He also wrote a really good one about 5 years ago called The Big Book of Pennsylvania Ghost Stories. If you have any interest in sort of statewide ghost stories, this is probably the best there is. In terms of the Lancaster, Reading area, there's a man by the name of Charlie Adams. Charlie Adams III, who's written a number of different books. So I pull some stories from his Ghosts of Pennsylvania Dutch Country Ghosts and Legends. Chris Wolf wrote a book on Ghosts of Hershey and vicinity, and there's a chapter in there called Erie Ephrata. I'll pull some stories from there. And just, you know, a story here, a story there from a bunch of different places. But so that's where I'm pulling my info. I also pull a few things from the internet, but I try to stay away from that. There's plenty of websites you can go to that will tell you, you know, XYZ is haunted, but a lot of them consist of my grandmother's house is haunted, you know. And again, I prefer published sources, you know, something that's been vetted through a book. If you have any questions, please save them to the end. Again, I'm not an expert, so I may or may not be able to answer any questions you have, but I'll certainly try. So, okay, let's start. First, ghost story. First of all, there's sort of a ghost tradition in this area. It comes out of what's called the powwow tradition. And I'm not an expert on powwow, but basically it's sort of spiritual healing, sort of folk healing, folk remedies, things like that. So this area has a tradition with spirituality and ghosts and things like that. And I'll get to this later, but certainly here in Ephrata we have the cloister, and we had the spiritualists that were here for about 50 years up at the Mountain Springs Hotel. So there's a long tradition immediately here in Ephrata of spiritualists and ghost stories and things like that. Okay, we're going to start in Lancaster City. I'm going to kind of bookend this program with really the two most, at least in my opinion, the two most prominent haunted places in Lancaster County. Fulton Opera House. This is in the city of Lancaster. It's down on Prince Street. It's one of the few theaters in the country that is listed on the National Register of Historic Places. The building itself was built in the 1850s. The main ghost story that comes out of here actually sort of begins in the 1760s. And some of you may be not familiar with this particular story, but essentially there was a group of Native Americans in Lancaster County, a very small band called the Conestoga Indian Tribe. They lived in an area south of Lancaster, roughly the Millersville area called Conestoga. They had a small reservation there. They were under the protection of the county and state government. Pennsylvania was still a colony, but they were protected by the local government. 1763, Harrisburg is the frontier. The city of Harrisburg isn't there yet. There's a group of men from what is now Paxton area who were out on the frontier. If you're familiar with 1763, it's a very pivotal year in history. That's when the French and Indian War ended. That's when what was called Pontiac's Rebellion started. So you have Indians having a little bit of an uprising all throughout the West, Pennsylvania out to Michigan, roughly. So this group of men in the Harrisburg area, called the Paxton Rangers, weren't really happy with the fact that there was this Christianized, peaceful Indian group living within Lancaster County. They thought that this otherwise harmless group was passing information to hostile Indians. So unfortunately, this group from Harrisburg came down to Conestoga and essentially in the middle of the night slaughtered these Indians. They killed 6 at Conestoga. So fast forward a couple of days, the remainder of the tribe, 14 people, were essentially put in what was the Lancaster County Jail. The Lancaster County Jail was at the site of the Fulton Opera House. They were put in jail because it's essentially something of a fortress. They weren't there because they did anything wrong. They were put there because it's a building that could protect them. Well, unfortunately, nobody in Lancaster County really bothered to protect them because December 27, 1763, the 250th anniversary of that is coming up in less than a year. Paxton Rangers, middle of the day, trotted into Lancaster, proceeded to go inside what was then the county jail and slaughter 14 more people. So grand total, 20 people were murdered for really no reason. And it isn't that we know who did it in the sense that it was this group from the Paxton area, but we really don't know names because nobody really tried to find them. They tried, they did some interviewing, but really they didn't do anything. There's more to the story, but essentially that's it as far as Lancaster takes place. So, the 1850s, Lancaster County needs a new prison, so they built the current prison, knocked down the old prison. A man by the name of, I believe it was Christopher Hager, built the Fulton Opera House. It was originally Fulton Hall. The back wall of the current Fulton Opera House is the back wall from that jail. Some say that Christopher Hager left it there as a memorial. Some people say he was just being cheap and it was a perfectly good wall. But fundamentally, that back wall, if you go down Water Street, dates to, I think it's the 1730s. It predates the 1760s anyway. So the basement of the theater is known to be haunted by this group of Indians. It's not so much that they see people walking around down there. It's just a feeling of uneasiness, of being watched, just very eerie, very spooky. The theater itself has a number of ghosts associated with it. There's a couple that live up in sort of the rigging area. At one point, the theater had a center aisle. I don't believe it does anymore. I think it now has two side aisles. There have been actors on stage during productions that have seen a white mist move down the center. There's a woman by the name of Mary Cahill who she would only go after roles which would allow her to wear a white dress. That was her trademark. So they see a woman in white wandering around the theater. There is a second balcony that for many, many years was closed prior to the renovation in the 1990s. There was, at one point, it was closed to the public, but if you were a family member of someone in a play, they would let you sit up there and watch. And there was a lighting tech up there one day who was watching a production and saw an elderly African-American gentleman come in and have a seat. You know, he watched the production and left. So that theater tech, that lighting tech, went to the only African-American cast member and said, you know, well, what did your family member think of this production? And described the gentleman, and the actor said something to the effect of, that's my dad, he's been dead for 10 years. So, the Fulton is probably one of the two most haunted areas in Lancaster County. And it's been known to be haunted for a long, long time. St. James Church Cemetery in Orange Street. St. James Church it's a corner of Orange Street and Duke. Very early church, a lot of famous people buried there. There's ghosts that walk along Orange Street. It's a couple. Some say it is James Buchanan and Ann Coleman. James Buchanan, never married, was a bachelor. When he first came to Lancaster, he's originally from Franklin County, I believe. Comes to Lancaster as a young lawyer, becomes engaged to Ann Coleman. Ann Coleman was one of the daughters of the famous Coleman family of Lebanon, a very wealthy iron-producing family. I think the Coleman Chapel is named after them. But they owned Cornwall. They owned a lot of different iron furnaces, particularly in Lebanon County. But the story behind that relationship was one day Buchanan was out away from Lancaster on business. He came back to Lancaster, went to a client's house. He's a lawyer, went to a client's house to take care of some business. That client's wife happened to be there, got into a conversation with her, relatively innocent, they just had a talk. Well, word got back to Ann Coleman, his fiance, that when James Buchanan came back into town, he went to see this woman first rather than her. Basically a misunderstanding, but the father, I believe it was Robert Coleman, did not like James Buchanan. He saw James Buchanan as somebody basically going after the family fortune, as something of a social climber. So he did his best to use that situation to drive a wedge between the two. Ann Coleman refused to see James, would not open his letters, basically broke the engagement off. She went to Philadelphia to see her sister, to sort of get away from Lancaster. While she was there, she died. Some say she died of a broken heart. Some say she died of an overdose of opiates. Fundamentally, she died. So, James Buchanan was heartbroken and never really recovered. It's not 100% that this is why he never married, but my guess is this is why he never married. When he died, he had his correspondence with her. He saved them for, she died in I think it was 1819. He dies in 1867, I think it is. So he kept these letters for 50 years, something like that. after he died, his will stated that the executor of his will should burn the letters, and they were, unfortunately, so we don't have that source material. But some say that the ghost of James Buchanan and his one-time fiancée Ann Coleman are still seen walking up and down Orange Street in Lancaster. Some also say that it is the ghost of Ann's sister. Let's see here. Ann's sister. Ann's sister Sarah, and William Muhlenberg. William Muhlenberg was the rector. He was the pastor of the St. James Church. And it's a similar situation. Dad didn't like Muhlenberg. So he actually paid a $5,000 donation, stipend, call it what you will, for St. James Church to get rid of Muhlenberg. So, similar situation, Sarah Muhlenberg dies. Again, probably a suicide, but some say that that couple walking up and down Orange Street, is Sarah Coleman and William Muhlenberg. So, a few buildings around City Hall, Penn Square, are said to be haunted. This here is, you may recognize this, this is Old City Hall in Lancaster. This was a Masonic lodge at one point. Lancaster was the capital of the state of Pennsylvania prior to Harrisburg up until about, it was the 18 teens. I can't remember if it was 1812 or 1818. But this was state offices at one point. It was the City Hall at one point. Most recently, it was the home of the Lancaster Heritage Center Museum, which is unfortunately since closed. Now it's basically an empty building. I think there's some stores and whatnot on the lower level. But this is said to be haunted by the ghost of George Ross. George Ross is a signer of the Declaration of Independence. There's the part of Lancaster that I live near is called Rossmere, around where Lancaster Catholic is. They play football at Rossmere Stadium. But George Ross is said to haunt this building. Firemen are said to haunt the area of Central Market. Apparently at one point that area was a fire station, so they hear bells and they hear men going off to fight fires. Not far from Penn Square is the house John Reynolds lived in when he was young. John Reynolds was a Civil War general. And there's a ghost story connected to him out of Gettysburg, as most ghost stories are in this state. But he is said to walk the area of King Street. This is another love story gone wrong. John Reynolds was engaged to a woman by the name of Catherine Hewitt. When he was shot and killed at the Battle of Gettysburg, they found, I believe it was a ring. It was a ring or a necklace. It was some piece of jewelry that was engraved Dear Kate. Nobody in the family knew who Kate was. Nobody knew he was engaged. The thing is, Catherine Hewitt's Catholic. John Reynolds is Protestant. They were going to wait until after the war ended to get married. He didn't bother telling his family. I believe he was significantly her senior too. He was in his late 30s, she was in her middle 20s, something like that. But they couldn't figure out who this Kate was. So one day, after his death, Catherine Hewitt showed up on the doorstep of the Reynolds family and said, "Hi, I'm Kate." So she had pledged to enter a convent. So she entered a convent in Emmitsburg, Maryland. I believe it's Mount St. Mary's. That has always made sense to me because that's where Mount St. Mary's University is. But that was the nearest Catholic convent to Gettysburg, where her fiance was killed. So she kind of disappeared into history, but recent scholarship seems to think that she left that convent and ended up in New York State. But The ghost of John Reynolds is said to walk around King Street in downtown Lancaster. Rockford. Rockford Plantation is in, there you go. Rockford Plantation is in Lancaster County Central Park. Sorry, you could have said something. Rockford Plantation is in Lancaster County Central Park. It's not actually part of the park, but this was the home of General Edward Hand. Edward Hand was a Revolutionary War general. He was the Adjutant General of the Continental Army. He was an aide to George Washington. I believe George Washington, as he did many places, visited here at one point. This home was built after the Revolutionary War, but not long after. I believe it's the 1780s.
Where's this house again? I'm sorry.
This is Rockford Plantation. This is in Lancaster County Central Park.
Okay.
It's south of the city of Lancaster. This home today is a historic site. They also rent it out for weddings and things like that. But the ghost of Edward Hand's son is said to haunt one of the rooms on the second floor. There's a blood stain that the staff there can't get rid of. Edward Hand's son killed himself in this home. The Hands didn't live in it for too long. They had trouble keeping tenants. They rented it out, but nobody would stay there because of the weird things that would go on there. But as with many historic sites, I'm thinking Eastern State Penitentiary, the Gettysburg area, they sort of embrace the fact that it's haunted. And they do ghost tours, and if you pay them enough, they will let you do a ghost investigation there. But second floor is haunted by Edward Hand's son. The walking statue of Augusta Bittner. This is in Lancaster Cemetery. Lancaster Cemetery is located, it's the one that's kind of close to Lancaster General Hospital on Lime Street?
Lime Street.
Lime?
And New Holland Avenue.
Lime Street, New Holland Avenue, something like that. This ghost story is false. Historical evidence points to the contrary, but there was an article in the Journal of the Lancaster County Historical Society 2 or 3 years ago. The story is Augusta Bittner died on her wedding day, or on the way to her wedding, or something like that. So her family commissioned this grave. Rather expensive, because it's a statue. This was in the 1880s, I think? Early 1900s? But the story is that on certain nights, it's either the anniversary of her death, or a full moon, or Halloween, that the statue will walk around. And there are many people who have claimed to see the statue walk around. Historical evidence suggests she died young. She was married, she had a kid, so she didn't die on her wedding day. There's an inscription on the column here that says something like, "Could love have kept her?" And I think that's where the legend comes from. But the legend persists. This is a fairly famous, Lancaster County famous ghost story and statue. Like I said, the County Historical Society took some effort to debunk it, but it's still an interesting story to say the least. There's a sort of a companion story I like to tell with it. There was an article, there was a report in 1994 of a Civil War soldier, the ghost of a Civil War soldier shooting at somebody in St. Mary's Cemetery, which is the Catholic cemetery that adjoins Lancaster Cemetery. Strangely enough, the police investigated, didn't find anything, and therefore did not file a report. But that is Augusta Bittner. The Landis brothers' house and Nettie May. Has anybody been in this house? Does this look familiar? Okay. This is one of the centerpiece buildings at the Landis Valley Farm Museum. The Landis brothers, Henry and George, started Landis Valley. They started collecting things turn of the century. They ran it as essentially their own private museum up until the 1940s. The Commonwealth of Pennsylvania eventually bought it, turned it into what is now Landis Valley. This is the house that the family grew up in. It was mom, dad, and 3 surviving children. George, Henry, and Nettie Mae. Nettie Mae was the sister. She was a sickly child. She never really was healthy ever. But she was also Daddy's little girl. He doted her. She died young. She died when she was 34, I believe it was 1914. But her spirit is said to haunt this house. There's a music box that a staff member was in the house one time, heard music playing, couldn't figure out what it was, eventually discovered it was a music box playing. That music box had not been wound in many, many years. There's a curtain in this house that at one point kept falling down. The curators would come in, put it back up, it would fall down, they'd put it back up, it would fall down, etc., etc. There are volunteer tour guides and staff members who will not enter this house. There was a tour guide that took a group in there at one point, and there was a woman in the tour group from out of state who was going through the house and said she had no idea the story behind Nettie Mae, knew nothing about her, and said, "This house is haunted." Tour guide was like, okay. She was intrigued, just let her talk. So the woman from out of state started to say, there's a woman in this house, it's haunted, she died young, her family loved her, she loved her family. Tour guide was like, okay. The woman said, "Can I pray for her?" Tour guide was like, okay, go ahead. So the woman got down on her knees and started praying for the ghost of Nettie Mae. And when she was done, she said, "It's okay, spirit's at peace." So that is the story of Nettie Mae. Okay, let's go to northern Lancaster County. Mannheim. Mannheim is the home of what is known as the Cloak Man. Generations of Mannheim residents would report seeing this individual. No one ever saw his face, they only saw him as a fleeting glance. No one knows exactly who he is or why he haunts Mannheim. He's particularly known to haunt the area of Bull Alley, which is present-day Ferdinand Street. And he's known particularly to approach women at night. Nobody knows why he's there, but he's there. A naked man has been seen on the south side of Mannheim in an area known as Booptown. Several people report seeing this ghost. Apparently it has something to do with a boundary dispute. Also south of Mannheim, Indians have been seen in an area known as Kaufman's Park. Workers have seen the ghost of a young man in that area who hanged himself from a nearby tree. Is anybody familiar with Baron Stiegel? Does that name ring a bell? There are 2 people in the history of Lancaster County that are truly eccentric. Conrad Weissel is one, Baron Stiegel, Henry William Stiegel is the other. Henry Stiegel founded Mannheim in 1763, I think it was. He was an iron master. He's known for his glass. Stiegel glass is very, very sought after, very, very, very valuable. He was eccentric. I'm not sure at which house it was, but I believe he had a tower built at one of his houses with a lookout posted, so the lookout could inform the people at the house when Stiegel was approaching in his carriage pulled by 6 white horses. so that the people at the house could gather and welcome Stiegel appropriately. The Lutheran Church in Mannheim has a tradition that Stiegel started. Their annual rent is 1 red rose, which to this day they still pay to an heir of the Stiegel family. That died out for a little bit, but it's been brought back in the last couple of decades. It's kind of a neat tradition. But Stiegel doesn't so much haunt Mannheim. He haunts his home in Berks County, Lebanon County, Wormelsdorf. I believe that's Berks County, called Charming Forge. When Stiegel hit upon hard times, his businesses collapsed. He ended up in debtor's prison for a brief period, just around the start of the revolution. He ended up essentially becoming a clerk with his nephew, George Eeg, at Charming Forge. That's where Stiegel died. They think he might be buried out back at Charming Forge, but nobody really knows where Stiegel's buried. But Stiegel is known, Stiegel and I believe George Eeg as well are known to haunt Charming Forge. So that's Mannheim. And the reason that the Mannheim Central athletic teams are called the Barons is because of the good Baron Stiegel. General Sutter Inn. General Sutter is known in history as the unlucky guy who happened to own Sutter's Mill, or Sutter's Fort. When gold was first found in California, I believe it was 1848, just before because of the 1849 California gold rush, it was done on Sutter's property. Sutter never really prospered or gained any fortune out of the fact that gold was found on his land. Not quite sure how he ended up in Lidditz, but later in his life, he ended up moving back to Lidditz. And he's connected to the General Sutter Inn, which is on the square in Lidditz. I think it's something like the oldest continuously operating tavern in the state of Pennsylvania. It dates to the 1760s. Now it's known as the General Sutter Inn. Staff there have reported hearing things, seeing things. There's a couple of rooms in particular that they hear footsteps walking around. I believe it's room 9. Room 9 is said to be haunted by the ghost of a former owner of the hotel, Colonel Thomas Scott. A male presence has been felt there, and footsteps have been heard throughout the night. This is General Sutter's grave. There's a story behind his grave that I really, really love. Sutter died penniless. Lidditz is a Moravian town. It has been a Moravian town for a long, long time. Up until I believe it was like the 1850s, you could not live in Lidditz unless you were Moravian. The Moravians were kind enough to let otherwise penniless General Sutter be buried in their cemetery. Well, fast forward a couple years, the federal government decided that they were going to honor General Sutter. They were going to do so by erecting a 7-foot wall around his grave, a boundary marker. If you know anything about Moravians, they're pious people. A 7-foot wall around your grave isn't pious. All of their tombstones are flat. The idea is equality before your creator. Well, one of Sutter's granddaughters tried to stop this 7-foot wall being put in. So eventually she gave in and said, send the wall over, send the wall over. So they sent the wall over. But before the wall got there, they dug a 6-foot trench around his grave. So the legend is, and I believe this to be true, that you have a foot of wall here and 6 foot of wall down here. So it was a nice way of taking the largesse that the government wanted to give, but at the same time keeping the spirit of the Moravian cemetery. The granddaughter felt that the Moravians were kind enough to let otherwise penniless granddad be buried in their cemetery. We're not going to impose a 7-foot wall. So that's Sutter's grave. This is when I say truth is stranger than fiction. I love that story.
Yeah. Where's that located?
Yeah.
Moravian Cemetery. Exactly where that is in Lidditz, I don't know. Cedar Street. Cedar Street? South Street?
South Street.
South Cedar Street.
Why was the government honoring Sutter? What did he accomplish?
Well, it was Sutter's property that the gold rush started. That's what he's notable for. Sutter's Mill is where the 1849 California gold rush really got started. But Sutter died penniless. He didn't really get anything out of it. So, but it wasn't immediately when he died. I'm not sure when this was, but sometime after his death, they decided we're going to send a 7-foot wall. And I don't know why they did a 7-foot wall. You know, if you have a 7-foot wall around there, you're not even going to be able to see it. But that's the story. Okay. Northwestern Lancaster County. These are, first story is the Railroad House. The Railroad House is in Marietta. Built in 1820, locally it's known to be haunted. Room 6 of the hotel has been the site of many hauntings, including that of a man who shot himself. Disembodied footsteps have been heard upstairs in the dining room of the Railroad House. An employee has already walked past a man sitting at the bar. That man sitting at the bar disappeared. Room 9 is said to be haunted. I'm confusing my stories here. Sorry, I'm reading from my wrong notes. Room 9 of the Railroad House is said to be haunted by the ghost of a former owner, Colonel Thomas Scott. You've heard this one before. A male presence has been felt up there, and footsteps have been heard through the night. The garden is haunted by the ghost of an Anne Marie. She used to tend garden and there and hoped to find a rich husband. I don't think she ever did because she's still trying. Male employees and guests have been known to see her working in the garden to this day. Booby's Brewery. Never pronounce that. Boob's Brewery. I can never pronounce that right. It's in Mount Joy. It's one of the finest examples of a 19th century brewery in Pennsylvania, if not the United States. A good deal of the original equipment is still there. Now it's used as the site of a number of restaurants. They have a bar there. They have, you can eat in the catacombs underneath. I think it's called the Catacombs. There's also a restaurant there called Aloysius. Aloysius is the founder. Aloysius Boob was the founder of the brewery. The whole place is said to be haunted, including by a son-in-law and a granddaughter of Aloysius. They're said to haunt what was once the family dining room. And another ghost haunts a room on the 3rd floor of the building.
It's sold out on Halloween.
I believe it. There's a lot of catacombs around Mount Joy, including those that are in at the brewery. I've eaten there twice. I really hope they never have a power outage, because trying to get out of there would be interesting. You're basically eating in a cave. That's what a catacomb is. There's a large network of these catacomb tunnels underneath Mount Joy. Over time, utility work has closed them off and sealed them. But there's a prominent story of a white hermit from the mid-1700s that lived in those catacombs. The man was originally from Scotland. He caused the death of his stepmother and sister. He came to America to escape. He managed to survive for 6 years undetected before he was discovered. He is said to have had a vision that required him to go from the white hermit to the naked hermit in order to atone for his crimes. He died somewhere in the caves, and his ghost is said to haunt those caves to this day. The Ironville Headless Horseman. There's a lot of Headless Horsemen floating around out there, no pun intended. The town of Ironville is located between Silver Spring and Columbia. When I was a kid, I went swimming at the Twin Oaks Pool in Ironville. I know Ironville a little bit. The Ironville Tavern, like many taverns, has been a resting place for travelers and a community gathering place for years. One night there was a man at the tavern who stayed a little longer than he should have. He was supposed to be home by midnight. That's what he told his wife. He lived in Columbia. It was 11:55 p.m. He had to get home. He told his fellow tavern goers, "I'll be home by midnight, or I'll be in hell." So he got on his horse, started riding as fast as he could. There's one particular bend on the Ironville Pike that he failed to negotiate. He met up with a low-hanging tree branch. They found the headless body the next day. His horse was also dead. So, to this day, on the Ironville Pike, you will often see the ghost of a headless man and hear footsteps bumping down the road.
You mean
So-
horse steps?
Huh?
Horse steps or footsteps?
Hoofbeats.
Okay.
That one I get from Dorothy Burtz-Friedel. She wrote a couple of books. A lot of them focus on the Columbia, Marietta area. Ghost stories. Okay, moving closer to home. Ephrata. The Ephrata Cloister. I could be wrong on this one. I really could not find any ghost stories of the current day Ephrata Cloister. You would think that the Ephrata Cloister, being what it is, might be a haunted place. If you don't know anything about the cloister, the long story short is it's a communal group founded in 1732 by the other eccentric man from Lancaster County, connected to Lancaster County, named Johann Conrad Weissel. Conrad Weissel, that's his grave right there. We do know where he's buried. The people at the cloister believed in the imminent second coming of Christ. They thought the world was going to end at any day. They took that literally. There's a verse from the Bible that says something to the effect of, Jesus will come like a thief in the night. They took that seriously. They would sleep from 9 to midnight, wake up, go to church, sit there and wait for the world to end till 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. Clearly the world was going to end by 3 o'clock, so they'd go back to bed until 6 and then begin their next day. These are the people that sleep on narrow planks this wide and sleep with wooden pillows, things like that. If you haven't been to the cloister, the library has a free museum pass, shameless plug, to go tour it. So you would think that you have these white-robed people walking around the cloister at midnight, that there'd be some kind of ghost story there, but there really isn't that I could find modern day. Now, there are ghost stories that go back to when the cloister was still active. The cloister was a celibate community up until it's the 18 teens again. I want to say it's 1818, something along those lines. The last celibate member died. Up until the 1930s, it was run by a church, sort of a successor group to the celibate order. There was a secondary group when the celibates were there called the Householders. The Householders sort of formed a church. It was the Seventh-day German Baptist Brethren, something along those lines. They ran it up until the 1930s, when the state took over and turned it into a museum that we have today.
Well, wasn't it used during, I thought I read that it was used during the Revolutionary War for soldiers.
It was.
Oh, okay.
It was, yeah. The cloister was known as, they had some advanced medicine practices. So soldiers from Brandywine, which is Chester County, that battle, were brought in and some of them died. There's actually a ghost story related to that.
Okay.
But that's a slightly different place here in Ephrata. I'll get to that one in a minute. The ghost stories that come out of the cloister are, after Conrad Weissel died, many people reported seeing his ghost. That's basically the story. Now, this one is hard to keep track of because there's a lot of different, and I'm just going to go by the number of wife they were. There was a man by the name of Christian Beeler, I believe. Christoph Beeler. Had a wife. We'll call her wife number 1. Christoph decided to have an affair. Wife number 1 Christoph and his new girlfriend moved to Virginia. Christoph's wife, first wife, joined the cloister. Eventually, Christoph's first wife died, freeing Christoph up to marry his girlfriend, who became wife number 2. Eventually, wife number 2 died, which enabled him to marry wife number 3. Wife number 3 eventually started being haunted by the ghost of wife number 2, who eventually was joined by the ghost of wife number 1. So wife number 3 is being haunted by the ghost of wife number 2 and wife number 1. This is down in the Shenandoah Valley area of Virginia. They all have names. It's easier to call them 1, 2, and 3. So wife, and this was something to do with gold or money or something like that, because when Christoph was down in the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia, he became reasonably wealthy. So the ghost of wife number 2 and wife number 1 encouraged wife number 3 to come back to Ephrata to meet with Beisel to have a seance or something like that. So Christoph, wife number 3, Beisel, a daughter of wife number 2 and a daughter of wife number 1 all got together, had a reconciliation, and that's the end of the story. If you want, this does have this incident does have a name, and I can't remember it off the top of my head. There's a really good book about spirituality over at Ephrata by Jeff Bach called Voices of the Turtle Doves. That's where I'm pulling that story. It's out there, it's reasonably well known. And again, these people have names. I don't mean to disregard that fact, but it's easier to call them 1, 2, and 3. So that's the Ephrata Cloister. The Mountain Springs Hotel at Camp Silverbell.
Is that over there by Appleby?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Part of it still exists, most of it was torn down. This was built, the Mountain Springs Hotel up the hill, up on Ephrata Mountain, was built in the 1850s. Was a well-known local establishment. There's rumors that different presidents and different famous people stayed there. Known for having a spring with healing waters, so people would go there to take the waters. It started to decline early 1900s, was really hit hard by the Depression. I always found it kind of funny. You have an almost 200-year, over 200-year continuum in Ephrata of, and I don't mean to step on anyone's beliefs, but a little bit cuckoo religious groups here and there. Definitely unique, we'll put it that way. The cloister, definitely an interesting group of people. I said earlier, they were founded in 1732. Celibate order runs to the early 1800s. 1930, mid-1930s is when the state takes over the historic site, because the last group of people from that church, there were 7 of them, just kind of gave it up. 7 people can't really run this organization. And the last member of that church died about 10 years ago. I had a college professor at Elizabethtown, where I went to college, who is the daughter of this one. I can't remember her name offhand. Can't remember the last survivor. The daughter is Chris Bucher. But so you have the cloister group sort of dying out in the 1930s. Well, the spiritualists start right across the creek, right across the Cocalico Creek in the 1930s. So for about a 2 or 3 year period, I'm not quite sure even how they came to Ephrata, but somehow some spiritualists decided that they like Ephrata. They received an invitation. It was a group from Florida. It was a husband and wife from Florida. Came to Ephrata. They eventually became the majority shareholders of what is now Greater Park. So for a while, Greater Park was a spiritualist camp for a couple years. So, and that's in the 1930s. So on one side of the creek, you have the cloister dying out. On the other side of the creek, you have the spiritualists starting up. They were at the park for a little bit. Eventually, the town kind of rebelled and took their park back. Well, the spiritualists thought this hotel up on the hill. It's the 1930s. they're experiencing financial troubles, we'll buy it. So they bought it. So the spiritualists were up on Ephrata Mountain for 50 years or so, from the 1930s to the 1980s. There's a famous series of spirit photography. If you just Google like Camp Silverbell or Mount Springs Hotel, you'll probably see a series of pictures like this. This is supposed to be the ectoplasm incarnation of Silverbell, something like that. It's clearly doctored, but there's a whole series of them. Again, I don't mean to step on anyone's religious beliefs, but you know, take my opinion for what it is. You can draw your own conclusions. But you know, there's these series. I think this is 50s or 60s, but up until about the 1980s, the spiritualists were up at Mountain Springs Hotel. It lay empty up until 2004, when they knocked down part of it, renovated part of it to an office, built the Hampton Inn, built the Applebee's that's there. But before they tore it down, you know, you could see things in the windows, you would hear footsteps, all of the usual things. Chris Wolf, the gentleman who wrote the book on Haunted Hershey vicinity, the chapter Erie Ephrata, includes a good story on this one. Something like he was up there taking pictures one day, and he captured a few pictures that he says have spirits in them. But that's Camp Silverbell, locally known as the Spook House. I really do like that continuum of, you have the cloister, they go up until the 1930s, as the spiritualists are starting literally across the river, across the creek. So that is Camp Silverbell.
How long was the hospital in there?
The hospital was there. It was there in the late 30s to the 40s, maybe 10 years. The problem with the hospital was it didn't have an elevator. It was hard to get people around, so they built the current hospital in 1950, roughly. I had done a program, Halloween of 2011, on haunted Cocalico Valley, where I tried to focus on ghost stories here in the immediate area, not just Lancaster County. One of my last stops was to go over to the Historical Society, and I asked a couple of people connected to the Historical Society, hey, do you know any local ghost stories? And they're all like, no. Well, I found this on YouTube like a week later. October 2011, there was a couple of different clips, General Sutter in the Stoner House, which is near the Manheim Township Library, next to the barn there, a couple of different places that are supposedly haunted in the area. But this is the Connell Mansion. If you know the Cocalico Valley Historical Society on Main Street, it's the corner of Oak and Main. Big old house there is the Historical Society's museum. Right next to it is their library. Go say hi to Cynthia, she's a great librarian. If you have any interest in local genealogy. But let me play this.
Located in downtown Ephrata is an old mansion, currently the home to a museum. This house was once owned by Moore and Rebecca Connell in 1869.
There was a farmer in the area, and he dealt in real estate and in livestock. And he was a fairly wealthy man, because this was a wealthy house in the state.
So I can't turn it up too much more because of the speakers.
And they lived here their entire life. And a lot of people lived and died in this house.
Nora Connell was the only member of the family that didn't die in this house. In the 1950s, the lower floors of the house were rented out for the purpose of sending off the dead.
The first floor and the basement was rented out to a man named Numbers, and he had a funeral parlor in this house. And the basement was used as the embalming and corpse preparation area for the funeral parlor.
Over the years, tourists and paranormal investigators alike have witnessed odd happenings. One even captured this image just outside the front door. Aside from the dead that were once downstairs, it is the neglected living that once resided upstairs that made our medium quake.
Where I started to really get the energy was though on the second floor. And actually, the room that we were just in, that we came out of, where I felt panic and confinement, it was confirmed that, of course, a child was locked in there, mentally disabled.
Because of her illness, that daughter may have spent years locked in her room. Overall, the house definitely has some emotion connected to it.
I would say that souls do come and go through here. I would say that pictures bring energy of souls into a home. It's a beautiful, gracious place, mansion. But I would also say, because it's steeped in history, there are definitely spirits.
You've seen the building, and you've heard their story. Now it's time for you to decide. For Haunted Lancaster, I'm Peter Taravarelli.
It's an interesting series, but apparently I talked to the wrong people at the Historical Society. Okay. I'm going to kind of go through these kind of quickly. I apologize. I do got to keep an eye on my time here. Ephrata Monument. Up by the football stadium, there's a big obelisk. That is where the Revolutionary War comes in here to Ephrata. The Battle of Brandywine, Union. Clearly, I'm too attached to Gettysburg. Colonial soldiers were wounded at the Battle of Brandywine, roughly 200, I believe it was. Brought here to Ephrata to the cloister for care. Some of them didn't survive, unfortunately. That's how it works. There were about 100 who were buried in a mass grave underneath that obelisk. It's just up here, Old Mill Road, next to the high school. Probably driven by it several times, many times. But the legend is that on certain nights you will see the ghosts of Revolutionary War soldiers marching around in that area, essentially keeping watch on that grave. Old Bethany Cemetery. This is another one of those, similar to Augusta Bittner, this is another one of those died on her wedding night kind of things. Outside of Ephrata, on Parkview Heights Road, is Old Bethany Cemetery. It's next to a nursing home up there. Can't think of the name off the top of my head.
Bethany.
Bethany Manor?
Ephrata Manor.
Ephrata Manor.
Yeah.
It's said to be haunted by the spirit of Sarah Wilms. She died in 1799 at the age of 29. She was the daughter of the minister of Bethany United Church of Christ, which still exists here in Ephrata, just at a different place. Sarah died on the day she was to be married and was buried in her wedding dress. People say they see her form walking around that cemetery. Okay, a couple of stories I'm going to go through quickly. Adamstown has some interesting ghost stories. Ironville has a headless horseman. Adamstown has headless pigs. There was a butcher shop located next to a distillery in Adamstown. The distillery would take its leftover grain, pour it over the fence so the hogs in that butcher shop could eat. The hogs got fat. Eventually, well, they're hogs in a butcher shop. They got butchered. For many generations, residents of Adamstown have reported seeing the ghost of headless pigs wandering their streets. There's a little black dog, you'll excuse my poor clip art, but there's a little black dog that's known to just show up at different points in Adamstown. Nobody knows why. It simply vanishes eventually. There's two ghost women in Ephrata, and my German's really horrible, but it's die Weißfrau und die Schwarzfrau. Woman in white, woman in black. These two women are known to walk around Adamstown. They never look at each other. They never really cross each other's paths until they get to a cemetery outside of town. Not sure which cemetery. When they get to that cemetery, if you follow them in, they simply vanish. I'm going to skip the Devil's Racetrack. Vera Cruz Road. West of Adamstown runs Vera Cruz Road, formerly known as Lard Lane. There is a ghost that is said to wander in a field in that area. It moves through those fields and then simply vanishes.